All right. Well, we are back. Last episode, we talked about why spiritual direction matters and is so helpful. And in this conversation, we're going to really dig in what is spiritual direction? How is it not therapy? How is it not just talking with spiritual friends? What does healthy spiritual direction look like?
It's such a good question, and it's such a hard question for people to get real answers to. I
Sure.
find that often when we're talking about spiritual direction, it gets all squishy, and it feels like people say, well, you just got to do it. And like, I'm not somebody who's getting on the roller coaster until I know where it's going. So it's such an important question to ask. And spiritual direction is usually a one-on-one relationship with somebody who has been trained in this kind of listening, or someone who is wise, someone who has years and years of lived, mature experience in God. And it is about meeting regularly. Usually, practically speaking, it's about an hour with somebody, and you are either coming to them or meeting them over Zoom or something like that. In the ancient church, people were even writing letters as spiritual direction. But it is this time of coming and allowing the space to see what freshly arises in your life with God. As the directee, and there's a little bit of jargon in spiritual direction. We've got director and directee, but director doesn't mean the one in power. It doesn't mean the one directing the show, so to speak. It really means the one holding the space, and the one, in a certain way, being hosted by you, because you are allowing someone onto the tender ground of your own soul. And so it's usually that sort of hour time. There is often some kind of centering to bring us into the intention of the time in some way. And different directors are different in terms of what they bring. I love bringing poetry or silence or whatever else that the directee feels is kind of giving God the first word as you begin your time together. And then just seeing what arises. Sometimes a directee comes with, I've got a lot to talk about. And sometimes some of my favorite sessions are when someone sits down and says, I have no idea what we're going to talk about today. Like, wow, this is going to be fun because God is going to show up with something. We're going to discover and unearth that together. And there's also group spiritual direction, retreat spiritual direction, like with pastors, priests, and guides. Those times where you're meeting with a community in a holy listening kind of way, or you're meeting one-on-one in a very intentional container of, I have come to be away with God. And so those are different types of spiritual direction. But what I primarily practice and what I train others in is in that one-on-one ongoing relationship of listening to your life with God.
Okay, Tara, what makes for an effective spiritual director?
Yeah, it's funny because that word effective, I really do believe that God is effective, right? But there are some ways in which that can be results oriented.
Sure.
And I think a really great spiritual director is relationship oriented. I talk about being a non-anxious, non-manipulative presence with others, which is to say, I'm not here. I don't have an agenda. I am not manipulating anything out of you. I am here for and we've agreed together that I'm here for your relationship with God. And that's even different than my relationship with God. And that's what the work of a really good spiritual director will do, is that they have their own self-awareness around their own God language, their own places where they're not as free to listen without agenda. They've done their own interior work in terms of their own healing. And we don't have to be perfect to be spiritual directors, but we have to be in process. We have to be continually aware A really effective spiritual director is also one who's going to be in supervision, who has someone else that they talk to so that they are as free as they can be for you. Um, and I would say an effective spiritual director is one that fits with you as a directee,
Oh, that's so good.
because
Yeah, that's
that's
right.
not
Yep.
everybody is a fit for everybody. And there are all sorts of different styles of spiritual direction. And so somebody who would, somebody recommends their spiritual director to you and says, this person is amazing and they've changed my life and you should go see them. And you get into a session and think, I can't do this for
Yep.
whatever reason.
Yep. Yep.
That is not your fault. Like
Yeah.
that person may be a great spiritual director for person A, but not a great spiritual director for person B.
Yep.
And that is okay. It is a space of finding the right fit. And even I've had, at this point, I think 3 spiritual directors over the course of my walk with God, and they've all been different for different seasons. I have stayed with my current one for nearly 12 years now. But I've also been with directors in short seasons. I've seen directors at retreats when I'm just wanting somebody to accompany me in that space as well. So it's not like you're sort of stuck forever with a spiritual director. But I do talk about often the difference between therapy and spiritual direction, in that therapy you eventually want to get out of. Like the goal of therapy is that level of health that you don't have to always be in it. Always having a good check in, like coming back to therapy when you need it, is super healthy. But spiritual direction is sort of an ongoing relational companioning that is not primarily based in there being a problem. It's primarily based in there being a relationship.
There's so much there. I wish I could slow it down and pull out. Oh man. Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Can you say you're the kind of director you try to be,
The
non-anxious?
non-anxious, non-manipulative presence with others.
Oh, that's so good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In seminary, I actually took one class on spiritual direction. I was so interested, and one of the things that I loved is she would talk a lot about open and honest questions,
Mm-hmm.
rather than questions that we all know are not questions. Have you ever thought about, and she just said,
Mm-hmm.
open and honest questions are questions you actually don't know the answer to,
Mm-hmm.
but you're trying to create space. And that strikes
Mm-hmm.
me as one of the gifts of a spiritual director,
Mm-hmm.
not just leading you in sneaky ways,
Nope.
but opening new rooms to
Mm-hmm.
explore together.
Mm-hmm. I have a colleague who talks about holy curiosity being one of the
Yes.
gifts of spiritual direction, and I think that that space of wondering where this is going, it's one of my
Yeah.
favorite questions that gets asked in scripture. Is occasionally Jonathan says it to his armor bearer at one point, who knows, like that sort of
Mhm.
like open-hearted, open-handed trust with God, that even if we're asking a question that is going down a dark alley,
Hmm.
that seems to be um, a space of, um, oh, I don't know if I'm ready to like to go that way or to ask that question, or because in some ways there's some questions that we ourselves are too afraid to ask, that a good spiritual director will not rush you into,
Hmm.
but will hold with you. And even if a good open question is asked, a really good spiritual director will see when you brace and are like, I don't know, and say, there's no rush. We don't have to go there if your soul is not ready. What feels present when I ask that question?
Yeah. Final question. What have you seen in your life and in your directees has been some of the fruit of being in spiritual direction?
Oh, I think my face might split for smiling. I mean, uh, self discovery, honesty, intimacy with God, discovering that their ways of being with God are rich and holy and good, finding images of God that they didn't know they held that are false, and being able to smash those and be free of them, um, being uh, being held in grief, in profound grief, seasons of grief, but really in discovering the depth of their own relationships with God, and seeing that deepen and broaden and widen, for them to be so grounded in the love of God, that they are people who walk about as the light, not out of a striving, but out of a becoming and a more deeply becoming and a more deeply becoming, and
Yeah.
people who are also full of laughter. Um, as an Enneagram 4, I can be overly serious. And I think one of the profound gifts of spiritual direction is that, um, I have learned and I have seen in others that we take ourselves less seriously. There's an ability to step out of survival mode and to play, and to receive the delight of God, in and with them, even in really tough circumstances. I mean, on some level, I've just listed the fruit of the spirit, but like that's really what I have seen, and even in people who have been in long seasons of struggle. Um, I think one of the things that if I could somehow remove it from people, that they say most often, as some form of self contempt, I think, is when they're sitting in spiritual direction and they say, "Oh, I know I always say this," or "I know we're back here again." Um, and and I have never once thought, "Oh gosh, we're back here again" with someone. Not in almost 20 years and literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that I've sat with. Have I ever thought, "Oh, we're back here again"? It is always deeper. There is always more with God. And we are so trained in self-contempt, that it is a reflexive response to the thing that is before us. But instead, I think spiritual direction for me has taught me to welcome what is without judgment and to see where God is leading in it.
There is nothing I can add to that. That's beautiful. Thank you, Tara.